hope you readers, dear readers, didn't have a heavy lunch, right? Because as much as we have thought for food, now there will be plenty of food for thought. I invite to join me in this session the writer of this particular session, Annie Zaidi. Please, Annie. A very good afternoon to you. Welcome to the city of Nagpur, very famous for its oranges, chana poha, and tigers. Fortunately for us, the VLF people have taken care of the tigers. So sometimes, now that we are sandwiched, this particular session at Tamarind is interestingly enough sandwiched between 400 years of Deccan history that is going on in another adjacent room from Khilji to Shivaji, and in another room about the most secured prison, which I believe is the Tihar jail. Interestingly enough, therefore, the book in conversation, Annie Zaidi's book in conversation, is a book which is titled Unbound. So, before we proceed, a quick introduction about Annie Zaidi. Sometimes, I always feel that the best introduction to a writer is taken from her own lines, and I believe these are signature lines taken from your poetry, from one of your poems where you write, "If only we knew what to blame, all things become speakable, only once they have a name." And I believe Annie Zaidi writes to speak of all things wanting a name. She writes to name those that are often rendered nameless by force, by violence, by cruelty. And her words speak for those that are silenced by incalculable wrong. I have been following Annie Zaidi's writings now, ever since the VLF announced her as one of the writers to be visiting us. And she's somebody who comes across as a writer who calls a spade a spade. She's also somebody who has an extremely powerful voice in her writing with a strong sense of social justice. So whether it is feminism or terrorism, whether it is democracy and politics, or it is women's rights and women's equality, she lets the world know unequivocally what she thinks about it and makes no bones about it. And I feel Annie Zaidi is one writer who, in a sense, fulfills what Margaret Atwood, Nobel Prize winner last year, says about writers, that writers are not here to conform. Writers are here to challenge. They're not here to make the readers feel comfortable, but they're here to shake things up. And Annie Zaidi is one who shakes up all through her writings. A brief summary of what her writings have been. And the most interesting thing about Annie and her writings are that she traverses different worlds. She writes in many different genres, using different kinds of different styles as well. She's published one novel called Tribute to a Rat, a novella named Gulab, and a collection of short fiction, love stories, 1 to 14. Her first collection of non-fiction is a book titled Known Turf, Bantering with Bandits and Other True Tales, which was shortlisted for the Crossword Book Award in 2010. She's also co-authored a book with a very interesting title which says The Bad Boy's Guide to the Good Indian Girl. The Bad Boy's Guide to the Good Indian Girl. The book in conversation for today's session is a book that is an anthology titled Unbound, 2000 Years of Indian Women's Writing. But before we go into the book, and before I ask Annie to talk about the book, a couple of other things, some very interesting facets about this, about Annie as a writer, that she not only is a somebody who comes from a journalistic background, but she also is an award-winning playwright, with two of her plays going on to win, one of them titled Untitled One, which won the Hindu Playwright Award in 2018, and a radio play called Jam, which won the BBC International Playwriting Competition, Asia region, if I'm not mistaken. There's an interesting anecdote later on that we probably will bring it up in our conversation. She also is a playwright making, and her plays have been staged in Mumbai as well as in Delhi to critical acclaim. Two of these I should mention. One is Jal and in Hindi, and the other is So Many Socks. Incidentally, So Many Socks has also been nominated for the prestigious Meta Awards. Besides that, Annie Zaidi is a pretty strong and visible presence on YouTube and social media. She's directed 5 short films. She's also made a documentary titled, in her words, The Journey of Indian Women, to trace the lives and struggles of women as reflected in their literature. Last but not the least, among her most recent achievements, that she is also the 2019 winner of a special kind of competition which was called 9 Dots Prize. It's a prestigious book prize created to award innovative thinking that addresses contemporary issues. Her entry was a 3,000-word essay titled Bread, Cement and Cactus. And we will be, perhaps if we have the time, I would like to take Annie into telling us about this particular essay. Over to Annie, and maybe we can start with the book in conversation that is Unbound, 2000 Years of Indian Women's Writing.
Right. So, to begin with this book, Unbound, 2000 Years of Indian Women's Writing, this was a commissioned book. It was not a book that I would have dared to do on my own. The publishers, VLF, David Daldar was the commissioning editor. He called me and he said, so we are looking to do an anthology of the best Indian women's writing across all time, across all languages, and do you want to edit it? And I said no, because I didn't say a flat out no. I did say that I don't think I'm the right person to do it because I'm not an academic. I don't have a background in research, and this is the sort of thing that needs a lot of research. And I haven't even, my postgraduate training has been in journalism, not in literature. But then David said to me that we're not looking at an academic approach. We're looking, to us, you are the ideal reader and your taste and your voice matters more. And then I said, okay, let me think about it. I had for a while before that, because I've trained as a journalist and I write for a living as well. So for a long time I had just been doing a lot of writing and doing a lot of deadline bound writing, like every week churning out column after column. And for a long time I'd been thinking to myself that I wish I had a year of just reading. And just then David called, so I thought maybe it's a sign, it's some kind of spiritual sign that perhaps this is what I should do. And so I said, okay, I will give it a shot. I spent 3 years reading exclusively Indian women. Anything that I could find in English translation, I read. And initially, part of my reservation also for doing a book like this is that my instinct is against labels. I don't like labels, I don't like to be seen as quote-unquote woman writer. I like to be seen as writer. And now a lot of my contemporaries, a lot of my friends, half this room is women. So I didn't know if there was any significance now to a book like this. Like, how does it matter? Women's writing, writing is writing, is what I thought. But after maybe 2 years of reading exclusively women, I also found the answer perhaps to why this sort of book is necessary. The fact that we live in a patriarchal society even now is a separate issue. the first thing that I discovered was the level of stereotyping within my own head. I had these ideas about what women's writing is like, what kind of fiction they write. If they write about the domestic sphere, I had ideas about what kind of domesticity it is. I thought of their fiction. I write in my introduction, one of the things that I used to think of it as kitchenized fiction. You know, that's the sort of thing, and that's the sort of thing I want to be associated with. All my stereotypes just completely collapsed once I started researching this book. Because one, they write about everything under the sun. The difference between men's writing and women's writing is the difference between men and women in the world in general. This famous book, The Second Sex, for instance. Yeah, so why are we called the second sex? And why have scholars and feminist commentators pointed out that a woman is not born but she is made, right? Womanhood is not just about sex. Female is sex. Womanhood is not sex. Just like manhood is not necessarily being male. There are many layers to understanding what is manhood and what the meaning of masculinity is. So once I started reading the texts of women, and Indian women in particular, I finally began to understand the meaning of womanhood and the meaning of Indianness, and how these things, these ideas are very stereotyped, and the necessity of questioning and challenging not only what makes up women's voices, what makes up women's stories, but also the idea of womanhood itself. One of the earliest texts that we have of women's literature, where we can be sure that the author is a woman. A lot of Indian literature is anonymous, and a lot of Indian literature we assume may be written by women, but we're not 100% sure. So I avoided a lot of Sanskrit texts where there was speculation. I reached out to some Sanskrit scholars, but they couldn't tell me with any absolute certainty which texts were written by a woman or not. But amongst the earliest are texts in Pali by Buddhist nuns. If you read some of the works that they were writing, a lot of what they tell us about their lives is not very different lives of women today. And we see this pattern repeating in a loop. A lot of the texts survived as oral texts. Women very rarely were educated. Men were very rarely educated too. Literacy was rare in the ancient world. It's a very modern phenomenon, literacy, reading, writing, printing, publishing. But having said that, there was so much I didn't know about the lives of women. Through the doing of this book, I also got a picture, a slow and kind of hazy, it's still very hazy, but a composite picture of what the lives of women were like, what women's history is like. For me, this became a project about reclaiming my own history as a woman, and as an Indian woman particularly, as a woman of the South Asian subcontinent. How do we define who we are? How do we define what our history has been? Because our history is different from the history of men. The way we are taught history, a lot of that history is about battles, it's about who won how much territory, and a lot of it is about men. There are some women, token, queens who happen to be in positions of power. But the lives of women, the subaltern woman's life was very different, and we only have access to these records through their literature. Some of it oral, some of it written down. So for me, this was an act of reclamation. It was an act of starting to inhabit and embody all of that collective history. And it was also, finally, it became an act also of honoring our foremothers, our literary foremothers, our collective foremothers, but it also became a template for the future. In my introduction, I say something. When I was writing the book, I visited a library. The library, there was this quote by Premchand, and he says that lekha kya hai? Lekha ka purpose kya hota hai usme? Purpose is not a word he used. I am using that word. He says that sometimes we say that a writer's job is to entertain, and he says a writer's job is not to entertain. And then some people say a writer's job is to hold up a mirror to society. And he says a writer's job is not to hold up a mirror to society. He says a writer's job is to uphold a flame that will light your way ahead. मशाल लेके चलना होता है, वो आगे का आपको रास्ता दिखाता है. So when I look at the question I asked myself when I was putting together this book is the texts that were written 2000 years ago or 1000 years ago or even 150 years ago. These are old texts, right? And we can say that they have very little relevance to our lives now. But are they still lighting our way ahead? And the answer to that is yes, that they do light our way ahead. They show us the way forward. This is not an exhaustive collection by any means. My editor said the best. I said I cannot be the judge of what is best. But I will make a selection of what I consider the most significant. So there is fiction, there is non-fiction, there is poetry, there is drama, everything is represented. And anything that I consider significant from historical, literary, thematic or political perspective is represented in the book.
Right. I love the way you said, that you are a breaker of labels, that you don't like labels, you don't like stereotypes. And I think therefore, to look back in 2000 timeline, a timeline as vast and as remote and as fast as 2000 years of women's history, women's histories in Annie Zaidi's collection are women's her stories. Histories, masculine, male, like I was saying, in the next room we are talking about Deccan history from Khilji to Shivaji. And here we are talking about histories of women's writings. And women's writings, I think it was Alice Walker who said, that when it comes to women's writings, the hiss and the histories should be turned into her stories, right? And I think it's a very fantastic collection in which I'm staggered by the idea of, what David Devida asked you to do, because you're covering 2000 years, right? Now that's a gargantuan task. To me, it appears that, among the many challenges that you would have encountered, probably three most. One is the selection itself. How far back in time, which would be the, first of all, who among the thousands and thousands of women writers, who would be the most representative of an era or a decade or an age? Second, which kind of writing, since the anthology is a collection, as you said, of plays, fiction, non-fiction, memoir. So which type of writing, which genre of writing? And third, how much of it is to be excerpted and included in the book? Can you tell us how you handle these three challenges, or maybe even more?
So I read everything, like I said, everything. I read hundreds of books. I think what saved my life was the fact that everything is not yet translated. If everything had been translated, it would have taken me 10 years instead of 3 years. Having said that, I was looking for two things. One is the significance of the text, the other is literary quality. So for instance, from the Therigatha is the name of the collection of the writings by Buddhist women. There are also writings by Buddhist monks, which are called the Therigatha, and the ones by the nuns were called the Therigatha. The Theris were writing, and there are many Theris. I represented maybe 3 or 4, not more than that. So they correspond roughly to the same era. They're writing all in Pali, but I picked out the ones that I like the most. So it reflects my literary taste as well. It also reflects different themes. So for instance, this is partly the result of just the way our history is shaped up. In the ancient times, writing was very expensive, and paper was near impossible to find. A lot of the texts were never written down when they were created. So there was a gap between the creation and the preservation of the text. But a lot of what survived, there were two kinds of texts that survived. One was hagiographies, things that the kings used to commission. And usually this used to be in their own praise and, in praise of the royal family, etc. Or there used to be texts that were religious or spiritual in nature. Those survived, which is why the Buddhist texts have survived, some of the Bhakti texts have survived. Up until I think about between 2000 and 1000 years, this was the norm. Then slowly there was more writing. It was still very restricted until about, I think, 300 years ago when printing press made a lot of changes possible. So I decided to look at the literature of that entire period and find that in every age there were different themes covered. One of the things that I find very troubling, even now, is that there tend to be stereotypes and labels about the kind of writings women do and the kind of voices that they have. And the assumptions about, within that, the assumptions about what a woman's take on a subject might be. So I was very keen on breaking down that stereotype and showcasing also the great diversity even within the same theme. So the first section is about spirituality. And you see the fierceness of, I mean, if you look at the Buddhist text, over and over again, each of the verses ends with, and then I found Nibbana. Nibbana is Nirvana, right? So they describe various aspects of what my life used to be like, and then I have left everything and I have gone towards the Buddha's path, and now I have found Nirvana. But when you come to the Bhakti poets, when you look at the work of an Andal in South India, or you look at the work of a Mirabai, these are very passionate. And so the first section is spiritual love. The second I call secular love, and I use the word secular advisedly. I don't mean it in the way we understand it now. Secular is the opposite of religious. Like literally that is the meaning. Anything which is not religious is secular. But I find that there is a lot of overlap and that the boundaries are not hard and fast. So for instance, one of the examples I can give you is the Ramayana is a holy text. It's a religious text. It's had many versions, many retellings all over the country, many languages. Molla was a Telugu poetess. She told Molla's Ramayana is very well known in amongst readers of Telugu. There is one passage, so the rest of it is interesting, but this one passage I found really striking is when Sri Ram looks at Sita for the first time. Now, the text can be religious, but when Ram is looking like Sita, his feelings are not religious feelings, right? They're romantic feelings. So I consider that section as a piece of romantic writing because Molla has written a very sensual description of Sita, looking at her from Ram's eyes, and I consider that a romantic piece. I do not consider that a religious kind of embedded within it. Similarly, there's Mudupalani. Mudupalani's work was celebrated in the 18th century. She wrote it in the 18th century. But she was a Devdasi and a consort of the king. And her work was celebrated as long as the king lived. Then the British rule came. And the British, with them, their values, like Madhvi was talking about, over the last 200 to 50 years, our general moral values underwent a lot of change, and things that were acceptable suddenly were no longer acceptable. So the same book was actually banned by the British under pressure from a lot of the local, the elite, a lot of the Brahmins. They started to say, no, this is vulgar. But it is very sensual, but it is a religious text. Radhika Santvanam is a text in which Krishna has to woo back Radhika. After him being married, Radhika herself gets him married, but then she gets upset that now she has lost him and now he has to woo her back. So it's a very sensual text. And people started to say that no, this is vulgar. So this was banned, and it was only after India won independence and we had our own government in charge that finally the ban was lifted in this text. So I think that Indian women's history is also important to look at from this perspective. We have a lot of ideas about what is modern, what is not modern, what is today's woman, what is yesterday's woman. Until you know your history, how do you know what was who we are? When we say Indian woman, what does it mean? What is the meaning of an Indian woman? Is Mudupalani an Indian woman or is she not? So can we aspire to be like her or can we not? I think for me all of these challenges were very important to, when I reach out for these voices and I choose that, okay, this voice is important to reclaim for this reason. not only because of the quality of the writing, but because of the context in which it happened and what happened to the text and what happened to us as a result of that text.
Right. Interesting. Two important things that I found fascinating about your book, and which probably I'd like you to elaborate. One is that it's a selection of about 80 writers from 80 women writers from different periods. And there are categories, the way in which you have divided the entire book and the contribution of so many women writers into categories, like what you mentioned. You began with spiritual love, there is a section on secular love, then there is women writing on food, children, family, marriage, as well as battles. To me, the book is fascinating because although these pieces you have segregated under different categories, there are many pieces that speak to each other, not just within the section itself, but also across the sections. So somebody like Bama, for example, or Baby Kamble, for instance, writing about womanhood, writing about writing about gender oppression, would be speaking across to another writer like Kutti, for example, in another section. That is interesting because there are cross-either conversations that are happening, leading to which I feel is one of the most concrete things that emerges out of your book, that it is a book not just about the history of women's writings, but it becomes a book which is more significant because it becomes a book about the history of many ideas about womanhood. The idea of womanhood. In the earlier section we were talking about the history of sexuality, the history of desire. So womanhood itself becomes, there are so many sub-themes to it. Do you, your response to that?
Absolutely. I consciously chose to construct the book as a conversation between women writers. See, when we say of motherhood, for instance, I chose not to name my section motherhood. I name it children. Because when we say motherhood, many things kind of come into our heads about, that, mothers love their children. One, not all mothers love their children. This is such a stereotype. Secondly, that love is a very colored love. It can be extractive, it can be demanding, it can be many things. Secondly, the raising of children is not only about mothering. There are many things. So for instance, one extract is from this Hindi book called Banti. It's the story of a single woman who remarries, and then what happens to the child who is now contending with a stepfather, and the stepfather is not unkind. But see, the raising of a child also involves this, the mother's right to find love again. And then what happens then to her responsibilities as a mother, and what happens to that child who now has to contend. The child's response to the mother is as significant as the mother's response to the child, and the writer's response to both mother and child, and the third factor, the man, is all of it is woven into ideas of children. Another thing, if I may just read out a very brief poem by a Hindi poet called Mamta Kalia, bilingual poet actually. So to illustrate further the point you raised, this poem actually is on a section called Marriage. But it's the last poem I have put because it is also about children. The next section is children. There is marriage and there is children. And this poem, two poems from Mamta Kalia, are about both marriage and children, and they're sort of on the cusp. So moving through different aspects of marriage, you come to children, and then from children you come to another section called children, which may be about marriage, but not necessarily, because children are not only about marriage. So that's the way I try to shape it, wherever there's overlap, to kind of place each piece of writing so that the overlap is considered. It is not accidental. This poem is one of my favorites, and where is it? Yeah, it's called Brat. Looking at my navel, I'm reminded of you, Mama, how I lay suspended by that cordial cord inside you. I must have been a rattish thing, a wriggly roll of shallow breath. You, perhaps, were hardly proud of your creativity, except for the comfort that I looked like Papa and not like the neighbor who shared a bathroom.
Okay.
So, thematically, when you look at a poem like this, is this about marriage? Is this about children? Is this about jealousy? Is this about having to share household space? Is it about living in a chawl where you share bathrooms with other people? It's about all these things. And I was interested in selecting pieces of writing which reflect the density and intensity of meaning in every piece of writing.
Tracing this long journey that you have done as part of your research for the writing of this book, how has it shaped you and evolved you as a woman writer? I mean, pardon the label again, right?
So one of the things that it has done for me is that I have stopped resisting that label. I have actually embraced the label. And I think that not just as a woman but also as an Indian. The researching of this book completely changed my idea about what it means to be an Indian. There was a time when I used to think that there wasn't much difference between being an Indian woman citizen and being an Indian citizen in general. And now I know that there is a world of difference. The rules have always been different for women. And before we become citizens of our country, we have to learn to be citizens of women. Learn to stand up for who you are, and you're first a woman, is my feeling. And for those of you who are not women, you also have to understand how the dice has been loaded against women all this time, and how with every step forward, there is also the risk of going one step back. So when you push forward, you also have to push forward with enough momentum that even when people try and push you back, you still keep going forward. The incremental gains you make will take, for instance, I will give you a small example. The piece of writing I have extracted from a Bangla text written by Rashindari Devi. Now, Rashindari Devi was an upper caste woman, wealthy, in some sense a wealthy woman you could say, from a Brahmin household in Bengal. She had 1 year of learning. When she was very little, maybe when she was 5 or 6 years old, she was taught the alphabet, and then she was married off while she was still a child. And then she was given no access to books, learning, nothing. At some point in her life, she started to want to read again. And remember that she, despite being the mistress of the household, she spent a whole day in the kitchen and looking after children. And she writes this in autobiography, that there was one child, then there was another child, and then there was another child, and then there was another child. One child would want something to eat, one child would want to sleep, one child is crying in the middle of the night, and she was endlessly cooking. In the next room, her husband was a big man. He was receiving people, he was reading, he was writing. Everyone in the household was reading and writing except her. And at some point, she must have expressed a desire, but even in her autobiography, she does not express that as a desire that I wanted to read. What she says is that I had a dream, and in my dream, I was reading the Chaitanya Bhagavat, which is a religious text. So she says, okay, I want to read something religious. But even that she can't do without feeling worried that it will somehow affect her relationship with her family. So what she does is that in the old days, books were not bound like this. They were written on wood, on slats of wood. And each page was a separate entity. She started to steal one page at a time. She would steal it, she would bury it in the pot of rice, and while she was cooking, she would take it out and she would stare at it. And she just stared at it until the memory of the alphabets came back. She taught herself to read. Can you imagine that? This is not ancient history. This is hardly 150 years back. And from there, the progress that we have made. And she was a lucky woman. She was a wealthy woman. Thankfully, her children supported her. Thankfully, even in her old age, the book got published, which is why we even know. How do we know what the lives of women like her were like, right? And then can you imagine what the life of a low-caste woman would have been like? And then can you imagine the life of, anybody else, right up until after independence? So in the writing of these texts, these women were not just recording their lives, they were recording their times, and they were leaving a testament for the future. And it is good to remember these things. And I think that some of what I hope that doing a book like this is also to remind us that we fought very hard battles to be where we are. Fought very hard. And it is so easy to lose your rights through negligence, through assuming an equality that you do not yet have.
One of the battles, an ongoing battle perhaps, which may have changed its dimension in terms of its form and shape, is the battle of not only women trying to write, but also trying to get their writings to be read. And I think the publishing industry in India, even now, you're a woman writer, you've been published across all major publishing houses, but publishing, for example, in the last 50 years, especially in the history of Indian publishing, there have been specifically some women publishing houses that have been established, like Kali, for example, and I think Urvashi Butaria. This negotiation as a woman's writer of trying not only to, reclaim women's writings, but also to publish and to circulate them, is it not also an attempt to take back those spaces that have been denied, including, when I say take back those spaces, the spaces of publishing for instance, making a claim on those publishing spaces. Why? Because generally they have been controlled by men publishers and men writers. Any difficulties you encountered?
Well, as it turns out, my publisher was a man, but I think you should hear Urvashi speak about this. Urvashi and Ritu Menon set up a publishing house called Kali for Women, and then
Zuban as well, I think.
So Kali for Women then split, and now Ritu runs her own house, which is also focused on women, and Urvashi runs through Zuban. I interviewed Urvashi for my film. I made a documentary film, which a condensed version of it is available for those of you who are interested. It's called In Her Words, The Journey of Indian Women. It takes off on the research that is in the book. And one of the things Urvashi says about her experience then was that people were actually saying that, women's writing, but what is there, and is it there? And so some of that challenge was there for her. But she and Ritu and other women, like there's 3 in Bengal, there has had to be a concerted and deliberate effort to publish more women. One of the interesting things Zuban is doing now is that not just women, but within women to look for the gaps. Like women, but what kinds of women are getting published? Are we seeing mainly upper caste women get published? Are we seeing mainly English-speaking women get published? Are we seeing only women from mainland India get published? So she has now started to publish many more authors from northeastern states, many more from Kashmir, many more from islands, many more Adivasi women, many more Dalit women. So I think all of these are important collectively. It's not just enough to say women. It's also important to look for the oppressed within that category of women. I think people are making efforts.
Fine. It's very ironical and perhaps even strangely, humorous to find that a man is moderating a woman who covered 2,000 years of women's writing. I think what we will do, Annie, is let the women speak here and enter into a dialogue with you. Questions are welcome. I throw the platform open now for a Q&A session. And more questions coming from women would be more welcome.
Men are also welcome. Questions are good.
So my question is that you studied so many pieces. So, is there any common thread that you find, not in terms of theme, but in terms of, maybe feelings or moods that women have experienced, like oppression, or like Sir mentioned about publishing, or the backlash that you mentioned that women had after getting published? So, in terms of that, like what are some common threads that you found within all the works that you studied, and are they still relevant today?
One thing that is common, and I don't think this is common just to women, this is true of male writers as well, this is true of all good writing, I think, is that you question the world around you. And women question it in different ways, but that remains a thread, but I don't think that is a woman-specific thread. I think and that is something that remains relevant as well, that you question what you see around you, and what you see can be anything. It can be a bad relationship, or it can be the status quo, or it can just be ordinary norms, what we call rasm rivaj, or it can be, or sometimes it's just self-expression that I'm here and I'm feeling like this. And I think the act of doing that, of just saying that this is what I'm feeling, this is what I'm observing, this is what I'm thinking, it is one way of expressing your humanity. And women writers who write and write well, they take their full share of humanity. And with that you take the full responsibility also of humanity. No other thread that I have observed.
Ma'am, first of all, I want to congratulate you because you have put forth a very significant work. So you are going to be a big name in women writers. My question is, there is going on, a lot of work is going on about women, on women, by women. A lot of publishing is going on in multiple formats. Like I myself am studying a graphic novel, which is talking about Savitribai Phule, who happens to be one of the earliest publishers, first woman publisher. So my question is, talking about it, publishing more, does this subaltern element become mainstream, or have we reached that stage where we have become mainstream? Are we, or will we?
One also has to interrogate a little bit this we. Like I said, that we are women, yes, and women's writing as a block and as a whole, it is one kind of, it is one way to define what the body of work that has been put out as. But within that there is Dalit writing, and within that there is voices that are further marginalized for some other reason. For instance, I don't know if you've seen it, but Zuban published this autobiography of a domestic worker, Baby Haldar. Right now, that was the first time I think that something like that was available, especially in the English format and in multiple languages. To bring Baby Haldar's voice into the mainstream was necessary. Does that mean Baby Haldar has become mainstream? Or does that mean that all domestic workers have a voice now in society? No. So I think all one can hope for is to begin a conversation. I look upon literature as a conversation that society has with itself. If we publish and read only one kind of writing, then that's like allowing only one person to speak in the room and telling all others, you shut up and just listen. So the work that you are doing, for instance, about Savitribai Phule, I tell you, when I was growing up, I had not heard the name of Savitribai Phule. I had vaguely heard of Jyotiba Phule. I had not even heard of her until I started researching this book, when I read a little of her work. And even then I read only a little of her work. Her work broadly is now being talked about, I think, over the last 4 or 5 years. So, and that hasn't happened in a vacuum. That's happened because many movements together, the women's movement, the Dalit movement, I think a lot of reclaiming of history has happened. When you put out narratives, counter-narratives, fractured narratives, underrepresented narratives, over 50, 70, 80 years, 100 years, very slowly we have come to this point where a lot of people, and even then I won't say all of India, but a lot of people have also heard of Savitribai Phule. I think we still have a long way to go. You can ask one more, yeah.
Chivalry is not there.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I have one, just like a question, comment, something like that. Given the case that we are talking about mainstream and the marginalized, it becomes very problematic why one should call somebody who has been in a privileged position as a mainstream, and whether their narratives are mainstream narratives or they are the marginal narratives. One. Then there are these gatekeepers, right? Both in the publishing industry, in the media, everywhere. The whole mass media has gatekeepers, and they have disallowed the so-called marginalized into the so-called mainstream. That is what we say, right? So it does not reflect upon the marginalized per se, but it reflects upon the character of the mainstream, the so-called mainstream. And therefore, that needs to be explored more in terms of why this is happening, right? Despite the fact that there are so wonderful narratives, there are so deeper elements of humanity that have been like continuously written from this, where we call it.
Say your question, please.
Yes, but in general terms, the way we define the mainstream, and the mainstream of, for example, cinema. In India, the default is Hindi. Even though Hindi is not really spoken by more than 50% of the country, but it has become the mainstream. And within that, there is the marginal Hindi cinema, which is not mainstream. And within that, there might be other many things. So the mainstream is whatever is ubiquitous, I guess. In literature, when we say mainstream, it is the kind of writing that has been published for a long time, the kind of writing that is available in most major bookstores, the kind of writing that assumes that it has the right to exist, right? So when, of course, people have challenged it, and it is only through the challenging of it that we have come where we are. I couldn't have done this book if before me, at least the last 40-50 years, other women scholars had already not been collecting this material. I am basing a lot of my work on the works of other women scholars. If they hadn't translated, if they had not published, I would not have had access to those texts. So I think one does this, but one does this incrementally and marginally. The question about gatekeepers, there are two kinds of gatekeepers. One is the kind of gatekeepers of power, which is that you come from a certain position of privilege and therefore you are keeping the gates closed to others who are not like you. The other kind of gatekeeping, specifically with respect to literature, is that of taste. Now this is very subjective, right? Because my taste is different from your taste, and one of the troubling things I find about publishing today is this narrative that there should be no questions of taste or literary sensibility, and that everything is equal. Now equality of rights is one thing. Everything has and everybody has a right to be published. Everybody, in my view, and this is completely personal view, in my view, everybody does not have the right to say that everybody should like everything and celebrate every kind of book. I have a right to not like things also, right? So as long as I am doing something, I have the right to say that, sorry boss, according to me this is not good writing. But yeah, I guess that it implies a certain amount of gatekeeping, but it also implies a certain amount of scholarship and readership. To have read 1,000 books before you can take for yourself to assume the right to make a judgment of quality and literary sensibility upon the work of others.
So in a session exclusively on women's writing, I think we'll allow two women to end the conversation and also have them have the last word. I think you had a question. Oh yeah, yeah.
It's writing and not just writing, if it is written, though it is written by women.
Continue being aware of is that the writing that comes from women is even now somewhat at a disadvantage. The gap is closing. I will absolutely not deny it that the gap is closing, particularly in the West. But research shows, and particularly this is something that I think all over the world, this change needs to be pushed for. Research shows that in general, women read both men and women. Women tend to read more than men do actually. And they read both men and women, but men tend to read mostly men. And no, this is true, And lots of publishers have said that if J.K. Rowling had not been J.K. but had put a feminine name on the cover, those books would not have sold as they did. Now, this is a problem. I don't know in the India-specific context how much of a gap there is, but from the West, most definitely we have facts and figures which show this. So a lot of women-specific writing has to struggle against things like publishers tend to put pink on the cover, they tend to put shoes or jewelry on the cover, things like that, which sends out a subtle message that this is about women and relevant to women. Now the thing is that when women read both men and women, we understand the words and the mindsets and the pressures of both genders, right? But if men do not read women adequately, or read them in a dismissive fashion, or read them only out of a sense of curiosity and not out of sense of learning that this might be relevant for the world at large, then we have a problem.
1,000 years of men's writing. Thank you so much.
Ma'am, for this amazing session, on behalf of VLF, we wish to gift you with a book and a token of our appreciation for spending some time with us. The gift has been sponsored by Sony OfficeMate, manufacturer and exporter of quality stationery products. The gift kit also contains the book titled, the gift kit also contains the book titled Chup Nahi Rahegi Ladkiyan by Krishna Nagpal, who is our author for this session. Who would like to gift it to you? Our next session is a panel discussion on modern love. Our panelists for this session